Thank you all so very, very much. We really appreciate the discussion this morning. I wanted to just take a moment to review our plan for the conclusion of the discussions and how we're going to try to proceed from this point. Our next hour is going to be devoted to a set of reflections from 4 clustered perspectives that relate to themes that were the backbone of the organization of our meeting. We're going to hear commentary on the potential risks discussion, a set of observations on the potential benefits. We're going to return to considerations and reflections on how to go about assessing potential risks and benefits and informing the broader assessment that we've been talking about this morning. And finally, we're going to also have an overview on policy implications of the issues that we have been talking about in the course of the last day plus. Once we conclude that set of observations, we're going to take a break and let all of that sink in. Then we will reconvene after our break, and that will give us an opportunity for everyone who's here who wishes to make further observations or reflections to do so. It's in a way will be a continuation of our discussion already this morning, and I hope that it will provide an opportunity for us to hear ideas and approaches perhaps that have not been aired in the course of our discussion, further comments on the direction and ideas that have emerged in the course of this presentation, and other sense of the meeting and direction for the future that anyone would like to offer. So that's what we're going to try to accomplish between now and when we conclude a little bit in the early afternoon. So with that background for the plan, I'd like to turn next to Chuck Haas, who will offer the perspective on the potential risks as we have covered them. Chuck, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I want to structure my summary around the steps in the standard risk assessment paradigm. I've added one up front, conduct of the process, which came out in some of the discussions. I bolded and underlined hazard assessment because I think the vast bulk of this meeting has been in the hazard assessment domain from the risk point of view. Exposure assessment, dose response, characterization, and there was also a bit of discussion that I've put under the risk management bullet. I didn't consult with Baruch before using this figure, but I think it's a very powerful figure in a number of senses because not only does it encapsulate the need for continuous stakeholder engagement, but as was joked by some when this figure came out, it indicates you can never get out of the circle. And really that's valuable because there's a growing assessment, a growing understanding that risk assessment is an iterative process. And as you gain more knowledge and more experience, updating is often useful. But the appropriate incorporation of stakeholders is clearly necessary to ensure fairness. This goes by the term of risk governance. When should the precautionary principle at all be invoked? I think that's a question that probably is worthy of some further consideration. In terms of the process, and this goes to, I think, one of Harvey's comments, there needs to be a firm delineation up front of the baseline from which risks and benefits are being assessed. Is it from the pause? Is it from the status quo ante? Is it from some other initial state and looking at the increments from there? A number of points on hazard assessment would seem to be the focus of attention of this meeting in my encapsulation of the discussion. One key point is to move beyond occupational to public health risk. The concern is over the broader public, interpreted over a large scale global. the need to regard influenza, SARS, and MERS differently from each other, and to look at distinctive characteristics. The question I pose is, to what degree is absence of evidence informative? There's been an argument that the absence of an effect does provide information. Is there a sense that is that a reasonable statement or not? I think there seems to be a consensus from what I hear that GOF is not a good term, although the preferred alternative seems to be unclear. Should the focus be when more than one of the properties of transmissibility, pathogenicity, and evasion of countermeasures is being addressed? And then is it possible to do a triage, to triage potential work into situations of minor concern, situations of major concern which perhaps should be avoided, and the broad middle where a case-by-case or class-by-class examination is in fact appropriate. We need to assess for a global context. Do the current categorizations of BSL and ABSL lab safety records give a basis for the sorts of situations that we're talking about here, or are there systematic differences between BSL, ABSL labs, particularly in the select agent arena, that differ from GOF, and do those differences need to be incorporated in a risk assessment? Are there finer gradations of lab capabilities that need to be set up to classify potential issues other than the existing BSL, ABSL framework? How do we incorporate deliberate and inadvertent misuse? And there was some discussion on this in the earlier panel. What's the relevance of information from the bioterrorism area? How do we incorporate the misuse of information as opposed to the misuse within the laboratory context? Exposure assessment, I put one line on here. I really didn't hear much about exposure assessment. When I think of exposure assessment, I think of the probability distribution of dose given an incident. And there was really no discussion at all about how that might vary with conditions. Similarly, for dose response, I think of that as the probability distribution of illnesses given dose, and again, really no consideration of that, jumping rather instead where there was a construct leading to an estimate from the fact of release to a consequence estimate without considering the intermediate steps that may result. Risk characterization. As I said, there's been a jumping right to the case estimation in the general population with perhaps too many lumped parameters that may combine, for example, environmental effects, host factors, as well as infectious agent factors. And I put up at least what amongst epidemiologists I think is a fairly standard construct of a disease triangle to highlight the fact that really those three elements, host, infectious agent, and environment, all need to be factored into estimating the outcome. Are there special considerations that need to be given in emerging entrants, emerging countries, emerging laboratories? More attention on host and environmental factors, more attention on uncertainty. Although the WASH 1400 quote, Baruch, was interesting in that, we can attempt to quantify uncertainty, but very often we don't know necessarily that we've incorporated all the factors that may influence uncertainty. On risk management, to what degree can deliberate biological modifications reduce or obviate risk? We need to balance the risks from not doing the proposed work, which were highlighted this morning in a couple of talks, against the potential risk from doing the work, particularly issues such as preparedness, response, and training. A risk assessment can inform decisions, but is not determinative per se. The concept of acceptable risk is a trans-scientific outcome more in the policy arena. For individual high-risk experiments, can a standardized approach or template be devised to assess more clearly those situations. And finally, or I should say, under what circumstances is the independence of an oversight process at individual institutions an issue? Is this a problem? Are there changes in framework and organization might be needed to manage the concept of risk assessment and decision-making? I believe that's my last slide.
Well, thank you very much, Chuck. Very, very helpful overview. Ron, let me turn to you now for your reflections on the discussion around potential benefits.
Thank you, Harvey. I want to begin by thanking the members of the organizing committee and staff who spent a fair amount of time around my computer last night refining the thoughts of what we in fact heard about benefits at this session. I think it was important to recognize that fundamental research, including gain-of-function research, does yield significant benefits, even though these benefits cannot always be predicted and are often serendipitous. In that case, the value of the research is not immediately known, which does make it difficult in terms of risk assessment, particularly if one tries to quantify the benefits. But there are research benefits that include developing animal models, vaccines, antiviral drugs, and therapeutic and prophylactic antibodies. We accrue benefits to medical practice and public health through this research, and gain-of-function is an important tool for increasing public health preparedness. Some of these will advance it. As I say, it's not always possible to predict breakthroughs that may occur as a result of this research. And there are long-term benefits out there that include core basic research in public health that are achievable, but I can't specify, and the group did not specify what those necessarily were. As we went through the sessions, we saw an emphasis on the fact that there were differences between gain-of-function research on influenza, SARS, and MERS viruses. We heard about development of MERS animal models as being a core priority, and that here we definitely needed gain-of-function research. The robust animal models for disease are essential for preclinical evaluation of vaccine efficacy and safety. We've heard that the current pause is compromising, in fact, the development of a MERS vaccine due to the lack of a suitable small animal model. And these considerations are broadly applicable to other pathogens and re-emerging pathogens such as SARS. Now, the specific benefits depend upon the specific research. So H5N1 gain-of-function research confirmed that vaccine stockpiles are needed, that the virus can mutate, and that, in fact, we can see the acquisition of mammalian transmissible characteristics. We may, through gain-of-function research, generate information not obtainable by other methods, and in fact, for some things, it's the only way we're going to advance the science. With regard to short-term benefits, these to date have tended to focus on the surveillance, diagnostics, and vaccine therapeutics fields. Certainly, we heard that gain-of-function research has informed surveillance efforts that are used to select candidate vaccine strains, such as the 2013 Cambodian H5N1 clade outbreak. It is essential that we make vaccines early if we're going to thwart the major effects of a potential pandemic. Near-term benefits may allow easier quantification of benefit for a risk-benefit analysis. And this, I think, remains to be actually demonstrated. But clearly, on the short-term benefit, we should be able to identify clearer endpoints that may be quantifiable. As I've said, it influenced pre-pandemic surveillance, strain selection, We've informed policymakers now that you have a risk of mammalian transmission, at least as demonstrated in ferrets, and that the same vaccines are likely to cover non-transmissible and transmissible variants. With regard to long-term benefits, questions do remain as to whether some gain-of-function experiments are essential for vaccine development. As we shift to increased reliance on sequence-based data, increasing use of motifs to predict phenotypes may have increased importance. And as more genotype-phenotype linkages are established, we can keep certain characteristics out of strains that we want to use for vaccines. I think we've also heard that the gain-of-function benefit should not be overstated, that model-based prediction needs further validation. We think the indirect benefits are likely to be substantial, that vaccine benefits of gain-of-function, though, require careful evaluation. And as field observations are more definitive than laboratory-based predictions, but nevertheless the sequence-based predictions to which gain-of-function experiments contribute may give us early warnings. We've also heard that we should continue to see reverse genetics playing an important role, and that it is important it not be hampered. In summary, I think there are a series of categories of gain-of-function benefit. One that we heard caution about we'll list as unfavorable, and this results in a combined increased virulence, increased transmissibility, and evasion of countermeasures. Another class would be controversial. It results in gain of knowledge or capabilities, but also represents significant risk, or a case-by-case consideration is needed. In other places where the gain-of-function benefit is undisputed, such as adaptation of viruses to growth and culture for vaccines and development of essential animal models for emerging pathogens, and escape mutations to understand drug resistance and immune escape. And these are the broad sort of considerations that we may have, and that ends the summary of benefits.
Well, thank you so very, very much. Now, if I may, I'd like to ask Baruch Fischhoff to return to the podium to reflect on all that we've heard related to the assessment of potential risks and benefits to inform a more complete risk-benefit analysis. So,
okay,
the floor
thank
is
you.
yours.
Thank you. So this will look familiar because I was revising my talk as late as 7 o'clock this morning, trying to make it as relevant as possible to the group. So this was for my talk. These are the tasks that we need to accomplish in order to take advantage of our analytical resources in this kind of this problem. Define risk and benefit, assess the risks and the expected benefits, communicate the risks and expected benefits, and organize to reduce the risks and increase the expected benefits. The bottom line conservations, this is the last slide from my talk, that we need to take advantage, to do a credible risk-benefit analysis. We need socially acceptable, technical sound definitions of risk and benefit, and I would argue here that, I argued here, that benefits here are of the same kind as risks. So we need the same, they're risks prevented, so we need basically the same methodology, although the details will be different. We need to make a strategic decision whether to focus on design or decision. We need proper disciplinary breadth in our analytical terms, and we need proper treatment of uncertainty. We need an ongoing, sort of continuing, scientifically sound, two-way communication with our stakeholders, so we do more relevant analyses, and those analyses receive the credibility that they deserve, and give us the best chance of a fair judgment of different versions of the technology. And we need organization for transparency and learning. in terms of observations where about how this might apply more specifically, it seems to me that this endeavor would do best to focus on design, on figuring out how to reduce the risks and increase expected benefits. We know how to structure the risk analyses. We've done that in many ways. Chuck's talked about some of them. Gavin talked about others. Working the benefit side of the equation requires the same intellectual technology, but requires, those are more difficult and really more interesting problems, and I would recommend an investment in formalizing the benefit arguments of the sort that we just heard, as well as formalizing the arguments for those who see alternative paths to see these same judgments. It's the same intellectual turn of mind. We ought to formalize them all, see which numbers are really important, see whether the controversial numbers that we have now are all we need given the sensitivity analysis, see whether the numbers that we have now that people have put out are even relevant to an analysis. Here I would I guess disagree with Ron. I think these are somewhat predictable, and I know the people that I would go to talk to. I talked to my colleague Erica Fuchs about what are the conditions of the industrial organization of research that will that are conducive to producing scientific breakthroughs, and then to seeing them seen through to applications. Erica's worked on photolithography and the organization of DARPA in its good days and bad days by various people's definitions. There are people who've worried about this in quantitative terms. You might ask Michael Gorman or Kevin Dunbar at Virginia about the conditions in which scientific labs further integration. So we know something about this. There are people who've already look at the world of scientific innovation in quantitative terms, others who know more qualitatively how it works, whose knowledge could be taken advantage of. Second, we would seek to inform decisions, not presume to make them. So anybody who thinks that putting out a contract for a risk and benefit analysis will tell the country what to do on this topic is just deluding themselves. There's no arguably gain-of-function research has a role something like that of nuclear power. Two generations ago, we were fortunate to have scientist citizens like Norman Rasmussen, who created WASH 1400, and scientist citizens like Harold Lewis, who are willing to look hard and see what analysis could and couldn't do. Third, that we need to acknowledge the subjectivity that exists and that is inevitable in setting the terms of any analysis. If you take a multi-attribute approach to things, somebody needs to decide which attributes have standing. Somebody needs to decide whether, if mortality has standard, whether we're going to be measuring it in terms of probability of premature death and or in terms of expected life saved. Somebody needs to decide how we're going to weigh the externalized costs to the rest of the world and the internalized benefits to the rest of the world that would take advantage of breakthroughs in this country if our social, political, economic systems allow, and we need some credible, socially acceptable way of resolving that subjectivity. And finally, we need to acknowledge the subjectivity in scientific judgments. As scientists, we all know all science is incomplete. As analysts, we know that all analyses are incomplete. We can do a better job of quantifying things that are often left out, like human factors, but there are certain things like the quality of the research, its possibility of producing surprises, which is sometimes called its pedigree, that will remain matters of judgment. We need to be explicit about them. And then last slide, we need to treat human factors in scientifically sound ways. We need to treat public engagement as an opportunity to increase the public's literacy, to build its trust in a community that's reaching out and pulling it in and taking its opinion seriously, and to accommodate the concerns. And it's easier in any design process. It's easier to accommodate your users' concerns at the beginning than at the end of trying to if you think of a bad design product where there's a warning label on a hairdryer that tells you not to use it in the bathroom. So a good design process is one where you don't have to do some kind of patchwork at the end. And then finally, and it's intellectually very, very challenging, this picks up on Ron's talk and several others, we need to determine the appropriate level of aggregation for making these decisions, considering the variability in the research and the resolution of our decision-making processes. So if we think it's appropriate to do case by case, we need to have some bodies that are appropriately staffed, properly resourced, and have public credibility that can make those case-by-case decisions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Baruch. I'd now like to turn to Alta Charo, who will offer some additional reflections on policy implications of the array of discussions that we've had.
So in some cases, the policy implications that one might draw from the conversations today and yesterday are very specific to gain-of-function research, or however one wants to describe it. In other cases, as you're going to see, a lot of the policy implications are really old news. It's the same problems that recurred regardless of the field. So to first focus on those things that seem specific, we heard yesterday, for example, in the panel that I had a chance to moderate, that in order to reduce the risks with regard to biosafety at least, you really do need a systems approach. It's a very complex approach. It involves investigators and research staff, local institutions, leadership, and also funder reviews both before, during, and after the protocols, including for every protocol change, and it requires representation from a very wide range of stakeholders, and that includes people that you wouldn't ordinarily have thought about. So, for example, the comment from Rebecca Moritz about the need to train the fire department to not put out a fire is an example of the broader community. And one of the things we've not really focused on also is the need to be attentive to those people who protect not just humans but non-human animals and the environment, flora and fauna, when we're talking about risks. So this is a very complicated and rather expensive and resource-intensive kind of process if you're going to continue to do the research while trying to optimize your mitigation of risks. So one thing that falls out of that is that in light of the range of the resources and their intensity, do we really want to spend our resources that way? And we did hear some people talk about how it might be better to spend our money on more conventional public health interventions if the goal at the end of the day is to improve public health by preventing disease. In that vein, we even heard that perhaps we should actually be looking at budgetary trade-offs. How much are we spending on this research and the protections, and also compare that to how much it would cost to move that money into public health. As just on a personal note, I have to say that as a close observer of what happens just a couple of blocks from here in Congress, I've not seen that kind of fixed budget zero-sum trade-off between research and public health, because if we did, then the CDC would be the wealthiest agency in the country, and the NIH budget would be 1/10 of what it is. And we know that's not what happens. So it does mean that that particular discussion has lots of room for being a little bit more nuanced in trying to see how trade-offs would or could be made. It's also been noted by some people here that the benefits and risks do not distribute in the same way, that the risks of this research, to the extent it involves pandemics, will affect everybody, and yet the benefits will disproportionately go to people who are either personally better off or in wealthier countries, because that's often where the healthcare system or economic access to healthcare is better. So one implication that can fall out of that is that we should just say, let's not do the research. It's not fair. The other implication is that we need to pay a lot more attention to making sure the benefits of it are more justly distributed, so that we don't necessarily stop doing science, but instead try to make sure that science is more beneficial for everybody. That's not something scientists can do themselves, but it is something that is important to keep in mind if you want to, and this is picking up on the previous presentations, if you want to maintain a kind of an approach of public engagement and the development of public support, that means that the entire public has to feel like they've got a stake not only in possible injury, but also in possible benefit. Now, looking at how it is that we would then proceed down a policy road deciding what we want to do, I was also struck by the way the conversation kind of slid unpredictably sometimes between looking at the value of gain-of-function research overall versus looking at its net benefit or its marginal increase in value when you looked at it as an add-on to all the other things that we're doing. And we saw that, for example, in the discussions around this can help us make new vaccines versus this was, in addition to everything we did in terms of monitoring, was very helpful in helping us to make more precise our prediction of which strain we needed to work on next year. And so understanding the policy trade-offs might be helped if we could really try to focus very closely on net benefits, but also on net risks, because the discussion of pandemic potential is not something that is exclusive to gain of function. It's there for every kind of research. We've got lots of problems. We heard about laboratory-acquired infections in the context of many substances having nothing to do with gain-of-function research. And so narrowing the conversation to both net risk and net benefit might make the conversation a little more focused and allow people to discuss or debate very carefully exactly what they are claiming. When it comes to policy, I think everybody's pretty much aware of the fact that we kind of range from do everything you want to regulate, but you can do it, to prohibit it completely. None of these come without further questions, but I wanted to really emphasize the key role that presumptions play. Because no matter how we go about it, there are going to be a number of experiments that are going to fall in some kind of gray zone. And whatever we do by way of default is going to determine how that gray zone will function. If we have a presumption that you can't do things and you must prove that your experiment is needed, then anything in the gray zone is going to be prohibited. And if the presumption is that research is free to proceed until the government or some other authoritative body has determined that it is simply unacceptable for some reason, then everything in the gray zone will proceed because the burden of proof will be on the government. I was joking with a colleague yesterday about the importance of these kinds of things, especially in the global context, because I remembered from back in the 1970s some Newsweek article that I've never been able to track down again, that talked about East Germany having a culture in which everything is prohibited unless it's specifically allowed. And by contrast, in the United States, everything was allowed unless it was specifically prohibited, and how this made the real difference between the countries. And I can't resist following up by the other two things they noted, which is that in Russia, everything, this was the Soviet Union, of course, everything was prohibited, especially if it was allowed. And that, and that in Italy, everything was allowed, especially if it was prohibited. Which is why I absolutely love going to Rome. So, but the serious point behind this rather amusing way of understanding cultures is to really make an important point about the crucial role that presumptions play in the construction of policy options. Whoever has the burden of proof is going to have a harder time. So you've got to figure out where you want to give somebody a hard time. That's a very fundamental choice, whatever your policy. The other thing is the need to have some degree of certainty, not only restriction beyond what might arguably be necessary, but even uncertainty. And we saw a lot of it when people tried to capture what goes into gain of function or A-trips or any other word that was really kind of a description of the criteria. Any kind of uncertainty may very well yield a kind of chilling effect on the pipeline of young scientists, and we saw some data just this morning about what they are saying now in response to an initial poll. And we've seen this problem before in human embryonic stem cell research. So this is not an unfamiliar problem, but it is one that we should always be attentive to. We don't want to discourage the next generation from becoming the new people who will be able to move the science forward. Whoops. So there were basically three approaches that I was beginning to hear in the people's descriptions about how they'd like a policy to work. One was to create some threshold beyond which experiments are either absolutely prohibited or they're given special attention. So we had one suggestion, and we've seen echoes of it, having to do with enhanced pathogenicity and transmissibility and resistance to countermeasures, being a kind of threshold. And after that, either things don't happen or in the regulatory version, they get a lot of very special attention. And we heard complaints that that this is both under-inclusive. There will be experiments that don't actually fall into that category of having all three traits, but you'd still want to look at them carefully. We also heard many people complain that it was over-inclusive because of the many reasonable experiments they were able to identify that had one or more of these properties. So another alternative that was suggested was absolutely pure case by case. And the way this might work, and it was described in the context of the funding process, is that you have a series of questions and you ask whether or not the experiment answers those questions in the best possible way. So you would ask, is this the right scientific question, and is this the best, from a technical point of view, the best method for figuring out the answer? You'd also then ask, does it in fact increase pathogenicity, and has that been mitigated? Does it in fact increase transmissibility? You'd go through each one. No one of them actually triggers an automatic action, but at the end of all these kinds of factors to consider, there'd be a moment of holistic review, and you would make a holistic judgment about whether this particular experiment poses some special problem that needs attention. That would be a case-by-case kind of review that does not have a threshold that automatically triggers something, but it also is very labor-intensive because you don't know which experiments to start with. You're presumably doing it for virtually all of them. The third is a kind of risk-based regulation system, and to some extent we have that already with regard to select agents. We say certain things we know are more likely to be dangerous, but you can also extend that to some of the human factor or historical data. If you've got a setting that has had a history of failures or near failures in biosecurity or biosafety, that might be a setting in which there's going to be special attention to the work that's being done there, regardless of the actual details of the experiment, because institutionally that place has not yet shown itself to be completely capable of managing. But another institution might have a very good track record and be deserving of some more consideration and some more leeway because they clearly have a system both for reviewing proactively and for responding in case of problems. So all of these are possibilities, and I'm not sure I've heard anybody actually decide which one is clearly superior, but they're all on the table. Next, yesterday, toward the well, both beginning and end of the day, we actually began to hear some discussion about some of the dilemmas that are created by the possible decentralization of the science. Most of the policy options I've talked about and that we've talked about are based on what I'd call a point source approach. Think about a factory that sends out pollutants into a river. The factory is the point source of the pollution, and the environmental laws we have will regulate the factory. They will tell the factory that you have to do things a certain way, that you have to measure things a certain way, that you can only release a certain amount. It's a very detailed kind of hands-on regulatory approach, which is possible because you have a limited number of sites producing a limited number of problems. It's an entirely different regulatory and policy challenge when you have what we would call non-point source problems. Think about all of the cities that you live in and all the people that use fertilizer on their lawns, which then runs off into the local lakes and causes eutrophication of the lakes. That's non-point source pollution. It's thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of settings, each one of which is adding only a small amount of damage, but collectively creating a huge problem. As a matter of policy, to regulate that, much more difficult. You don't want to have to go into every single household and regulate them as intensively as a factory. Sometimes what you do instead is you focus on outputs. You can only put out X substance, and other substances are simply not permissible. However you figure out to manage your lawn without putting out that substance, that's your problem, but you can't put it out. Other kinds of possible approaches also exist in environmental law, but I think the key thing here is to figure out how much we think decentralization is realistic here. We certainly heard that there's dissemination of information in a way that decentralizes the science and theory. We also heard people talk about some of the technical challenges in terms of equipment and also the kind of skills-based talents that are necessary to do this, and suggested that perhaps it's not nearly as decentralized as people fear. That is something that really needs to be better understood, especially in the biosecurity context, but also for the young, we're doing our lab in the garage kind of people in the synthetic biology area, to some extent for them as well. But this is more of a biosecurity problem, I suspect. I want to conclude just by noting that from the very beginning, this meeting has focused on the fact the work is global in nature, the collaborations cross national lines, and that therefore there's a whole special set of challenges that come with trying to deal with a problem not just within our own country, but across all countries. So you have, I'd say, at least four, there's going to be 40 probably, but four kinds of things to just alert you to. The first is going to be differences in national culture. That quote I had from Newsweek about East Germany and the Soviet Union and Italy and such is also about national culture. And when we had a presentation from OSTP, it emphasized the need to protect public health and also innovation. Both of those were in the same sentence. But every country is going to balance their concerns about minimizing risk to the public health or maximizing innovation somewhat differently. And it's that balance that drives the issue of presumptions, which in turn is going to drive a lot of the very fundamental policy choices. And I'm not sure that we really, I know that we don't necessarily have agreement on that balance, but I'm not sure we even completely understand all of the various national cultures to appreciate where they would kind of lean on that balance. The second is where the governmental powers lie. You know, the United States, being a federal system and one of limited government based on our particular constitution, often does regulation in a way that seems very peculiar to people in countries with more centralized governmental authority. So whereas here we might regulate research by putting conditions on the funding or prohibiting the use of money for something, in another country they may simply directly tell people you can't do this, which we don't do here. And that's a very, very big difference in how you go about regulating, if only because of the role of the private sector and whether or not it chooses to voluntarily follow the lead of formal government directives when they are not, in fact, in possession of government money. Excuse me. Second, some countries do a lot through advice or through the hidden threat of some future penalty, and others do everything very much through rule of law and the enactment of statutes and regulations. And again, trying to figure out how to come up with a common approach also means you have to make sure the approach is implementable, executable in the various different kinds of legal contexts. Next, in terms of relative resources, we have seen how incredibly resource-intensive this field can be, but countries absolutely vary in their capacity, not only to invest money, but also to provide the number of people with the necessary skills. Yesterday, we heard some discussion about the need for capacity building and also for mentoring, but certainly one of the questions, especially in resource-poor countries, is going to be how much is really expected of us in terms of investment to achieve some level of safety that might for us be considered adequate, but for you not be considered optimal. That will be a very tough decision. And by the way, again, completely common, you see exactly the same thing when it comes to environmental protection, food safety. These are absolutely old news problems for anybody in the policy world. And then finally, in terms of international governance, how do we manage the regulation or the prohibition, particularly the enforcement mechanisms, in cases of collaboration across borders where you have people that are working in labs on the same issues, but are now being subject to very different regimes and might be under different degrees of threat of restriction. That kind of problem also exists as old news in human subjects research and other areas, and to my knowledge has never been completely settled, so I doubt you'll settle it here. But those are going to be some of the challenges in moving forward in this case. Thank you.
Alta, thank you very much, and please join me in thanking all four of our presenters. Really super. I'd like to just take a minute, if I could, to pose a couple of questions really to each pair of presenters, if I may. I can't resist, given, Alta, your characterization relayed about the U.S., Russia, Germany, and Italy, to add that the old story about Switzerland and Singapore is that whatever is not prohibited is mandatory. So let me begin with a question, Baruch, to you and also Chuck. Chuck, you had a very tantalizing point in one of your slides that was really a question, which is under what conditions should the precautionary principle be invoked? And of course that invites a very, very deep discussion about exactly what do we mean when we use that term, but hold that for a moment. And Baruch, I wanted to ask you, in thinking about proceeding with an assessment in a situation such as the ones that we're facing, where the risk can be thought about as a very small likelihood of a very catastrophic possible outcome. That is, a strain of a new virus that can cause very widespread illness and potential deaths. As a general matter, stepping back from that particular, when you have a risk situation which is characterized by this attribute of a very small likelihood of a very large catastrophe, what, if any, special considerations or difficulties or challenges come into the analytic framework? And Chuck, I'd appreciate your comment on that too, particularly if that is a circumstance where you would say, well, that's a condition where the precautionary principle might be relevant. So, Baruch, do you want to begin, and then I'll ask Chuck to comment?
Okay, I'll try to answer both of our questions.
Thanks.
So there are people who would tell you that the public is incapable of understanding small risks or making difficult decisions. I don't believe that the evidence supports that. We as psychologists make our living and gain our insights by finding places where people stumble, because those stumbles often reveal important processes, just like optical illusions reveal things about the visual system, but without saying anything about how good we are at, how well normally sighted people are able to do their job. So I would not give up on the public on the basis of some glib meme about public incompetence. Often people respond in ways that are sort of perhaps seemingly contrary to the evidence, because we've done a lousy job of presenting the evidence, or we presented it in a clear but non-credible way. So I would say do the best job of characterizing the risks and of characterizing the benefits, recognizing the limits to the uncertainties, and we grapple with difficult problems all the time. There was an active public discussion about end-of-life decisions. Those are no more challenging than we are. But that's using analysis to inform decisions, perhaps illuminate alternative approaches. Again, think of the end-of-life decisions as an alternative. It's my take that the precautionary principle, one of the reasons behind it is I believe that the people who are uncomfortable about technologies, or more often uncomfortable about the people who are in charge of the technologies, are outgunned analytically. In fact, that's Barry O'Brien, whose book I showed here. I knew her as we lived in Eugene, and she was a founder of the Northwest Coalition for Alternative to Pesticides, and they were in some of the first litigation in the 1970s using risk analysis in order to characterize it. They just felt outgunned. And I think that and the point of her book is that people who are proposing something are often well-financed. They have a fixed proposal they want to see through. They've established the proposal without listening to anybody else and incorporating other concerns in their design. And it's made into an either-or situation, and the people who object, they're just outgunned. And I think part of the precautionary principle is to say, we can't fight you that way. We're gonna say there should be some red lines that we won't do, and we'll argue it as a matter of principle, which often, it may be the only quiver in their bow, but it often puts advocates of the precautionary principle as looking irrational, as though they're unwilling to accept, to make any kind of trade-offs, and it really isn't evident. There's evidence that people insist on zero risk. We all would like it if we could get it.
Chuck, do you want to add anything on your take relative to this question of the small likelihood, large consequence issues?
Well, yeah, first of all, I mean, I agree with what Baruch said about precautionary principle. I find myself in the same ballpark. Risk assessment has dealt with low probability, high consequence events in various contexts. Starting with the WASH 1400 report is the first example, but routinely people look at infrastructure responds to large magnitude earthquakes, which is another example of doing that. So the methodology is out there. The issue is you get a greater degree potentially of uncertainty in your estimates. And I would add, just in parallel, on the benefit side, you have low probability, high payoff benefits where you potentially could have high uncertainty as well. So the decision-making authorities need to understand how to approach the problem of making a decision where you have uncertainties potentially both in the costs and the benefits with low probability events.
Well, thank you very much. And let me pose a question, if I could, Ron, to you and Alta, because in your presentation, Ron, you gave us at one point a categorization of a way of thinking about how to approach thinking this through. And you had at one extreme those possibilities that were clearly unacceptable. I think you said unfavorable was your term. And on the other end, you had a set of possibilities that were undisputed in terms of their relative benefit and therefore merit to proceed in a usual way. And then you had this intermediate category, I think your label was controversial, in which you would then move to invoke an assessment of the benefits and risk. And I wanted to ask both of you, relative to Alta, your description of alternative approaches to policy, one of which you defined as a threshold approach, either if you get beyond it, you prohibit, or get beyond it in the other direction, you would approve it, or what you called, I think, the pure case-by-case approach, and your third option was something related to a risk-based analysis. I wonder if thinking about how these two relate, if it's not really a kind of nested way of thinking about the options, and I'd really appreciate having heard each other reflect in this way. What do you think the connections would be in these approaches if we were looking ahead to a time when the analysis would ultimately inform decisions on the part of the relevant agencies? So any comments on that from either of you I would welcome.
Well, let me start with the unfavorable. And I'm reflecting what I heard from the audience here. When asked the question, would you carry out an experiment that had this triple combination of potential for a pandemic, no one stood up and said you would do that experiment. Everyone said, essentially, that's off the table, that's not where gain of function is going. Now, either because they didn't see the benefit of it relative to doing the individual pieces, or that was a threshold of risks that they would not pass by. In the past, I've written occasionally about forbidden science, that there were certain sorts of knowledge that were off the table because, in fact, they didn't provide a clear enough path to a benefit, and they did provide a potentially high risk. On the other hand, if we look at the category that we had at the end that sort of said we really should be doing this, it was those experiments where the benefit really is preventing a pandemic or a major disease outbreak. If we don't have vaccines and therapeutics, we have problems in managing the outbreaks of disease. And the questions, well, what does it take to develop vaccines and therapeutics? It takes animal models, it takes the ability to test, it takes the ability to grow a strain in a way that will produce the vaccine. And so the categories at the end said, if we don't do these and we don't go into the benefits of them, then there's a real risk. So there's a risk of not doing them that was high. The middle category was, well, we think there's a benefit or it's marginal, and people are going to say, yeah, but there's a high risk. And that's where we propose that case by case. You really have to think through one of the approaches out that you had, and I'm not sure which approach in that middle category, but I guess I've presented sort of two thresholds. One, a threshold that said if we don't do it, we're really in trouble. The other is if we do it, we're not sure of a benefit and we may have created a real problem. And the middle that really requires the sort of analysis and the analytical approaches that you gave us.
Alta, do you want to comment too?
Well, it's a little hard to get incredibly precise about how you would kind of execute any of these approaches without knowing exactly who's going to be executing them, because are you talking about a funder, or are you talking about a public health department? I mean, that's going to change things. But I do think one of the things that is implicit in this description is a kind of debate about whether we should be trying to create these categories a priori and set them up ahead of time, no matter how well and no matter how, nuanced, or whether what we want is a more kind of organic approach where you start very much with case by case and every one of the factors that's been identified, including the history of the facility as well as the details of the science and of the scientist, or even of the current national security environment and what color we're at in terms of national security, that is all then considered for a particular case, and then that case is then decided yay, nay, or maybe. And then you move on to the next case, and you begin to build a set of precedents that guide the next case and the next case. These are two very distinct approaches. And the advantage, obviously, of having these a priori categories is that you give a lot of certainty at the front end, but the risk, of course, is the over-inclusive and under-inclusive problem. With the organic approach, you actually are able to make sure that you're responsive at every point to both the science and the kind of social and security environment, but you have probably a higher risk of letting a few things through or stopping a few things that you shouldn't have. So that's probably another basic choice, which is how much you want to be doing this as if it were a civil law country where they write a statute and they say that's how we're going to do things from now on, including with case by case on some things, or how much you want to do things the kind of American common law method and let things kind of build up from the bottom.
I guess, Alta, the other way I think about this sometimes is whether we're using a red light or green light approach. And I guess, at the bottom category and said there are benefits, if you had a green light approach that said under the normal set of conditions you're going forward with this, but there is a system in place to review, and there is a system that can say stop. And the other end of the spectrum, normally the red light is on. It says stop, don't do this, but under extreme conditions the system could reverse that. The middle category is always yellow.
Yes.
Well, one thing we do understand are red, yellow, and green lights. And I think for us at the panel right now, the red light is flashing. So I want to ask us again to please thank all of our panelists for their excellent summaries. We're now in a position where we can take a half-hour break. I would ask everyone to please come back promptly at 11:30 when we'll have an opportunity to hear from those who wish to offer further reflections. Thank you.
Non-point analogy.